Ladies and gents, it's my duty now to introduce our next presenter, our next speaker. I'm retired Max Speedy, and I think probably a number of people here today know Max, but there obviously are a number of people who don't know Max. So I'm going to read out his pedigree, his bio. I think you'll find continues on our tradition of some excellent speakers that we've had yesterday and today. Max Speedy, Ian actually.
No,
be very formal Ian. Max. Speedy DSC RAN joined the Navy in 1962 as an observer navigator. From helicopter anti-submarine warfare, he later went to sea venom all-weather night fighters operating for the Navy's aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne. He graduated his pilot's course in 1967 with no thoughts beyond flying the Navy's A4 Skyhawk fighter. Fate intervened, and in 1968 he was posted to the RAN helicopter flight Vietnam, which was fully integrated into the US Army 135th Assault Helicopter Company, an experimental military unit called, not surprisingly, the EMUs. I had to ask what that was too, so From 1967 to 71, 4 contingents of Fleet Air Arm personnel, pilots, aircrew and maintainers were to all intents and purposes in the US Army for the year of active service in Vietnam. Within weeks, Lieutenant Speedy was first platoon commander or leader with 10 Iroquois troopers helicopters, its American officers and crewmen. Later he became operations officer and with that became air mission commander, directing the daily troop insertions into enemy defended landing zones. He flew 1,250 combat hours, and many of the helicopters at the height of the Vietnam War. After Vietnam, a succession of postings occurred: 723, 817 squadron commands, XO of HMAS Vampire, staff appointments, and the like were all part of his 25-year career, retiring as a commander. Max has written a comprehensive history of the Navy's Vietnam involvement, a bloody job well done with Bob Ray, and was a major contributor to the Helicopter Flights Award of the Unit Citation for Gallantry. So with that impressive bio, Max, I'd like to present today on EMUs. Thank you very much.
Start. Yes. Good start. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the second time. The first time I spoke to the MHHV was, I think, at your inaugural one down at the Vietnam Vets Museum in Phillip Island, and I burbled on, I think, for far too long. Didn't know what I was talking about, so I'm hoping to be a little more clear on what it was all about, what I was trying to do. And hopefully, if there's any questions, that would be good. I didn't want that to happen. I did. Oh. Yeah, that's about where I should have been. Okay, I have 2 parts to this talk. The first is how did the helicopter get into the battle space, given that Vietnam was the first helicopter group. And so with that I can then talk about the group that I was with and how we interacted with the US Army in Vietnam at that time. As an idea, after Leonardo da Vinci, the helicopter was well and truly alive before the Second World War, and the landmark flight by Hannah Wright in the Berlin Stadium of the Football 61 was basically the debut of the helicopter. At the closing stages of the Second World War, Igor Sikorsky had his R4, two-seater, and it saw service in the India, Burma, China area with the US Armed Forces at that period of time. The helicopter was used in the Korean War, basically for personal transport and medical evacuation behind the front line. MASH, of course, Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, there are a dozen of them. Bell Sur helicopters, a pilot and two people as passengers in the front, or two patients as litter people on the outside, all working behind the front line. The French had been operating American helicopters in Indochina, and by the time they were run out of Vietnam, Indochina in 1954, Dien Bien Phu, I think they had about 40 helicopters, American helicopters in Vietnam, and they'd lost about 4 or 5 of them to Vietnam activities. And what's always surprised me is that having left Vietnam under a cloud, they could go to Algeria, and over the next 10 years, admittedly closer to metropolitan France, and probably having a point to try and make, which they hadn't in Vietnam. At the peak of the Algerian War, the French had something like 600 helicopters in Algeria, flying 37,000 hours just in 1960, and lost only 16 helicopters. The British were next up in my analysis. The Malayan emergency started in 1948, 12 years long. All sorts of aircraft were being used by the Brits in Malaya, but there were 3 squadrons of helicopters. Let's see if I get this right.
It's upside down.
Oh, what's it? No. No wonder it's going backwards. There we go. See, that's the early days helicopters. This is the style of thing that the British had by way of helicopters in Malaya. The Sycamore and the Whirlwind of American design. In those days, helicopters were so novel to the British that they had what they called an attractiveness ratio, which described how good it was, the helicopter was, in comparison to the Oster, the single-wing, fixed-wing aircraft. The Oster could fly fast, but carry about the same number of people as the Whirlwind, and the ratio came out at 30 to 1 in favour of the Oster. Things did get better. One of the things that did happen in Malaya was that to combat the terrorists, defoliants were used for the first time. 245T and 24D, which we know as Agent Orange. And interestingly, it was the precedent used by Secretary of State Dean Rusk, President Kennedy, to say that if the British were able to use it as an effective weapon there, then we have the precedent for it in Vietnam. Berlin, though, was ever the hot spot in all of this. Europe was where really large numbers of helicopters were going to be used. Something like 6,500 to 7,000 American tanks in Germany, and about 7,000 to 8,000 Russian tanks in opposition. And if there was going to be a ship fight, as there could have been on any number of occasions, the helicopter was going to be required to bring the troops in large numbers behind the tanks to take up the vacuum left by the advancing forces. That was Army's role. Air Force role, the American, by the way, I'm only talking about American helicopters today, very little about Australian or other forces. My focus, given the year I had there in Vietnam, was all American, and I'm staying all American today. When the Berlin Wall construction started in August of 1961, and a fortnight later, American reserves were called up, Secretary of Defence Robert McNamara started getting worried about the ability of Army to fulfil its role. Army had something like, in the late 50s, 600 aeroplanes of all sorts. By 1961, it had over 5,000 aircraft, all the way through to transonic fighters and everything in between, and well over 100 live programs saying this is what we'll do with this, that and the other if they're approved. Robert McNamara was of the view, and I believe rightly so, that with timelines out to 1970 and way beyond, for any of these projects, things really needed to get sorted out given the problems of Berlin. So a lot of reimaginative shifting around of funding streams. He got Army properly organised, and for the first time there were a couple of good studies done on the ability of, the potential ability of the helicopter to fill the armed space behind the troops in the planes that were perhaps going to be fought all the way through to Moscow. That was where the big numbers of helicopters were really thought to have their greatest use. But as Berlin quietened down, so did things in Vietnam begin to unravel. And we all know most of that stories about how the Vietnam War did unravel. But from a helicopter point of view, up until the end of 1961, from 1961 through to 64, there were about 35, 40 helicopters in Vietnam supporting the American advisor teams as they went around talking and teaching to the ardent troops. By the end of 1964, numbers had grown, as have the advisor numbers grown, to about 250 aircraft, most of them with the Bell Huey. Top left is the first version of the what was the Bell 204, given an Army livery of the XH1, I think it was, something like that, XH40. And Navy had the B model, slightly bigger engine, but it's the same airframe. Either of them could carry about 5 troops in cold weather. The Bell Huey gained acceptance in 1955 by the US Army, and as I said, that by 1962 it was actually in Vietnam. In 1969, the peak of the helicopter war in Vietnam, there were about 70 assault helicopter companies in Vietnam, each of them with 31 aircraft, flying at least 1,000 helicopters a day, every day. There were 7,000 odd Hueys went to Vietnam. Another 4,000 helicopters, all sorts of things, Chinooks, strike planes, big ones, little ones, and a lot of fixed wing stuff. The whole Army took the numbers of helicopters generally to a bit over 11,000. Now, Vietnam became the proving ground for all manner of helicopter tactics. The standard developed early was basically the ability to lift one infantry company with one group of helicopters per day from that company, and then multiples of it after that. The largest formation I ever took part in was, I can't remember, it was 80 or 100 helicopters, and either 40 or 50 armed helicopters, the gunships circling around the outside, and any number of generals on high above all this lot, telling us what to do and how well to do it. It was an incredibly unwieldy situation. It would have worked well, I think, in the planes across Germany and Poland, but land in Vietnam was not suited to such a big area. We're talking about a landing zone for that number of aircraft about the size of Melbourne Airport or Canberra Airport. And I wouldn't have been keen to have been in the lead aircraft, but sure as hell I wouldn't have wanted to have been in the last aircraft and go into that landing zone. Because the standard tactic was aircraft on the ground, troops out, and straight into contact. Now, there are going to be quite a few aircraft left behind in a landing zone such as that. The Bell here went under any number of enhancements. The first models here had 700 and then 900 horsepower, and then when we got to the real workhorse in the Vietnam War, which was first of all the D model, which was 1100 horsepower, but the H model, which was the one that did really all of the work with 1400 horsepower, was just about right to carry the team troops in tropical conditions, which is what we were able to do. Up above all of this lot was the Air Mission Commander. Most of the work that we did, and I'll explain this a little better later on, was half and half with the Army and the US Army. Very high-tech operations situations. It was basically, where was the action yesterday? I'm wondering if it's still there today. Let's go and find out. Paper maps, Chinograph, off you go. The bottom, well, the top two are an ops room, and I think the 7th Arden out over in the Delta somewhere. And the bottom on the left was my favourite Arden Colonel Zhu, who, when things were getting a bit tired around lunchtime, he'd tap me on the shoulder and say, "We'll go here for lunch today." And we'd land somewhere, a jeep would come up and he'd take us off and we'd go and have lunch with his village friends. It was a great way, not an easy way, I felt. I was always a bit nervous, but in any event we'd go off into all sorts of places to have lunch and show the flag. And then back after lunch and away we'd go again. Sorry, I should explain, with Vietnamese in the back controlling the troops, we would usually have an American advisor with us who would be able to translate what the Arden battalion commander wanted if he didn't speak English himself. Colonel Zhu was great. He spoke beautiful English and just hated having anyone with him. He was the boss, he knew how to do it, he didn't like anyone giving him advice. And any number of times he would sneak out to the aeroplane that I was flying as command and control, hop in and we'd try and jigger off before the American advisor could get to us. He wasn't popular for that, but we knew what he was doing. Around all this lot, the Vietnamese troops, of course. Around all this lot we had our supporters. Most of the landing zone's early days, we had the smoke ship, which was going to lay a smoke screen around what we expected to be the bad side, and it was a very useful aeroplane, but we started to lose too many aircraft, not because of smoking, but because of enemy action, and at one stage we were down to 17 lift aircraft, having to provide 15 every day. We had to give smoking away, which was a bit of a shame. But around that, the gunships would fly support for us. 4 gunships every day, 2 of them on station all the time, 2 went away to refuel, rearm. The guy on the bottom right was a warrant officer. He'd been to Vietnam any number of times. He waded ashore with the Marines at Da Nang in 1966, 65, 66, can't remember the year at the time, I think it. Did a year with them, then went back home, became a pilot, and he was one of my mentors. Great guy, Mex-Tex. When he got really excited, he just couldn't speak English and lapsed into Spanish, but I got the drift most of the time. And then later on, various types of the Charlie model gunships in the early photos of the two at the top, and then the Huey Cobra came along. Now the Charlie model was specifically built to be a gunship, but it was an interim job pending the Huey Cobra. The Cobra was good, it was very good, I flew it a little, but I think the gunship was far more effective for the type of weapons it had and the enemy we were confronting. No armoured enemy, soft targets all the way. The minigun on either side says a hell of a lot. Not that the Huey Cobra didn't, but yeah, it was a good effort. But the almost exclusive use of the helicopter did have its consequences. Using as an aerial command post reasonably safe up above kept the commander from his troops, and many said the commander ought to be with his troops on the ground directing the battle from there. But helicopters are easier to insert troops. Troops didn't have to march over the rough ground or go on trucks and be subject to ambush, landmines. You could have the helicopters bring the troops home at night, especially for the army, who were not A, trained for night fighting, and B, had to be back in their bases to look after the roads and bridges anyway at night time. It was far easier for everyone to go home and have a warm meal and a beer and a warm bed. The other thing that came up was the helicopter was certainly a useful way of putting the troops in. The enemy was given the opportunity to work out whether he did or did not wish to take us on. The noise of the approaching helicopter gave him an option. Do I wish to fight, or do I just simply retire and move back? One thing stood out though in Vietnam was that the terrain was such: jungle, paddy, mountains, endless paddy, endless swamp, nothing soft, nothing hard rather than flat. Everything was flat, but it was wet. There was no way trucks or conventional warfare methods, older warfare methods would have worked. And so this is how the helicopter did become the workhorse. For good or for bad, that was how it was. We'll shift now to how on earth we got there. The Australian Army was being supported in Iraq by 9 Squadron RAAF. 9 Squadron had B model helicopters, the small version, could carry 4 or 5 troops, perhaps, but the Air Force only had 8 computers, and keeping 4 of them online only gives you 16 to 20 troops per lift, which means, amongst other things, that you don't have a great capacity to move many troops quickly, which is why the Air Force wanted H models, which they eventually got. And one of the reasons for the Fleet Air Arm being involved was because Air Force didn't have enough pilots in their own pipeline. We had plenty, and so we offered Air Force, I think for a period of 2 years, roughly 20 of our pilots. A number of them came to Vietnam with A9 Squadron and transferred from 9 Squadron to our group at various periods during their tour of Vietnam. But in the main, once 9 Squadron got its act together with 16 D model, H model Hueys, the group I was with was able to move off into a wider remit. So whilst Air Force wasn't keen on the Fleet Air Arm being involved at all, the Navy masters really did want us to have a slice of the action, if only because if everyone else is doing this, why shouldn't some Fleet Air Arm guys be there? It was as simple, the logic was no more complicated than that. And so the final arrangement was that rather than being just with 9 Squadron, the US Army, which was having its own troubles in recruiting, I mean the numbers were huge. At one period, the US Army only had 12,000 pilots in its pipeline when it needed 19,000. And I don't know how you could do this with your tongue in your without your tongue in your cheek, but the Navy offered 8 pilots, 8 aircrew, a bunch of very well trained and senior chief petty officers and petty officer maintainers, formed a group of 48, and off we went in 4 groups to Vietnam from the end of 1967 through to mid-1971 when all the Australians were starting to move out of Vietnam. I was in the second group that went. The formation of the 135th Assault Helicopter I find quite interesting. US Air Force owned the skies, demanded all rules of engagement, and did not allow the US Army until 1966 any form of offensive fire from helicopters. After a lot of argument, in 1966 an agreement was signed between Army and Air Force that gave the Air Force Army's Caribou, which they really didn't want. The US Air Force didn't want because they'd been arguing all along that it wasn't an Army aircraft of any value, and all of a sudden they had to say, well, maybe it's all right for us now. But the Army retained its pilots, and one of the outcomes of this was a 135th Aviation Company, which had been Caribous, was reformed in Austin, Texas in the beginning of 1967 as the 135th Air Mobile Light, which was the assault helicopter company that became the EMUs in that year. Formed in the beginning of 1967, by May, their aircraft, the Huey aircraft for that group, 31 aircraft, had been built by Bell. In September, those aircraft were packed up and shipped to Vietnam. And in the middle of September, the aircrew flew out from Austin, Texas, in C-130s and 141s to Biennial. And on the 1st of October, the first CO of the 135th Assault Helicopter Company, Lieutenant Colonel Rennie M. Corey, met his troops for the first time. He'd come from another assault helicopter company out near Pleiku somewhere, as a Lieutenant Colonel to become the CO, the first CO of the 135th. He met his people for the first time on the 4th of October, and 8 days later the Australians arrived and the Americans met our Australian group for the first time in the middle of October. Whilst the aircraft are being assembled in Biennial, the 135th to get cracking with them, all the aircrew was sent out to other assault helicopters around Biennial mostly, to learn the ropes. 2 weeks later, the 3rd of November, they were declared operational and all the aircraft were available to fly. And the 135th began its own operations out of Biennial in fair support for the 1st Australian Task Force, but also taking on whatever else came up at the time. The first helicopter of the 135th Assault Helicopter Company to get shot down was 2 weeks later, the middle of November. It just happened to have an Australian aircraft captain as the aircraft captain. Crew of 3 others, Americans, shot down in the wrong sat in that swampy area west of Biennial and the lead up to Saigon area, and the pilot, Tony Casadillo, got himself an American DFC for holding off the enemy for half the day whilst people came in and rescued him. We've all seen versions of this map. The 135th had 4 bases in Vietnam. The first one was in Drum Tower, and that group, first group was there for 8 weeks. And this is a period when the Air Force, our Australian Air Force, are getting their act together with their Hueys, which allowed the 135th to be moved 8 weeks after arrival in Vietnam up to Black Horse. Let's see, does this point to work?
Somewhat.
Well, I won't bother, but anyway, Black Horse, I'm sure you can all read. That's Black Horse, December 68, Bearcat, December 69, Gong Tam, October 70, I think, and then the very last one's Ean at the end of the war for the 135th, back just east of Saigon. During Tet 68, there was a plan to actually move the whole of the 135th aircraft anyway, and those who were flying them on that particular day, up to Da Nang to put some relief in for the city of Hue. And interestingly, they were going to land on Red Beach, which is where this whole caper started in 1966 anyway. It didn't happen. There was too much business going on down in this part of the world anyway. But it was a move that I find rather interestingly could have occurred. Don't know why they would have picked us, but they did. Might have, sorry. As a company on a daily basis, we could be anywhere within 3 or 4 corps. It didn't really matter much to us because the daily brief was always exactly the same. Be it such and such a place, pick up the troops and you can go home when the battalion commander and the command and control aircraft says you can. An easy day would be 4 or 5 hours flying, which probably meant just putting a battalion into the field, moving them once or twice around a couple of landing zones, and then picking them up and taking them home that night. My longest flying day, that was one of the days when I was leading the troops, but my longest flying day, and therefore everybody else who was with me, was 14.5 combat hours. And the next day, more of the same. We flew every day of the week, usually 5, maybe 6 days of the week would be on combat assault. 15 of our own aircraft all together, we looked after ourselves, we managed whatever was going on. The 6th or 7th and or 7th day would be what was called direct combat support, which really was a euphemism for far more dangerous flying because you go off on your own and go to this base and that base and you pick up a few guys here and you take them there and you get some ammo to go over there and so on and on. While you're here, thank you very much, I want you to do so and so. And as an individual aircraft with no gunship support, we go into some fairly dangerous and hostile spots. But we operated everywhere and without making too big a deal of it, we operated on or over the Cambodian border on dozens of occasions. The border itself was not defined particularly well. Rivers in a couple of spots, but not many, and certainly nothing on the map. You could say, oh, well, there's Cambodia. And in some respects, we were a little bit like Air America pilots. CIA guys in silver Iroquois, they always stood out. Very well dressed, long slacks, short sleeve shirts, and a collar, just and always very quiet, well spoken, well shaven. Just landed here and there, did this stuff. Never opened the doors of their aircraft. You didn't ever see what was going on inside. But I've been into Cambodia and Montana areas, picking up their people, being relocated to safer homes down in the flatlands and wondering what the hell are we really doing. Anyway, I digress. The helicopter flight's rules of operating directive was similar but different to that of 9 Squadron. 9 Squadron required relatively safe landing zones, usually reconnoitred by the SAS prior to arrival in the landing zone. And certainly prior to the landing of the slicks, the rules did allow for the potential for a hot landing zone in a hot pickup zone to take the troops back home. But for the most part, the Air Force did not go into hot landing zones. Our directive from our Chief of Navy is beautiful. Should you be allocated a task which in your opinion is contrary to the provisions of the directive, endangers the national interests of Australia, or is likely to imperil unduly your flight, you ought to report the situation to Commander Australian Forces Vietnam. Having first informed your commanding officer of the 135th Assault Helicopter Company, you are established safeguards to ensure that your aircraft and personnel do not violate the territorial waters or airspace of countries bordering South Vietnam, nor to take part in operations near the Cambodian border. Beautiful. Now, as a co-pilot for my first, and as all of us were, American and Australian, going to Vietnam, where all co-pilots, you'd have to do about 200 hours as a co-pilot before you'd be able to be left on your own, or become an aircraft captain. Well, no American aircraft captain was going to give a damn about his Aussie co-pilot being unduly imperilled. Why would he? I was one of three in his aeroplane. And anyway, we really knew that the landing zone we were going to go into would be hot. Unless, of course, it was hot and we were already going back into it for the next time. That's fine. We knew that. But letting our American CO know that we were becoming imperiled was a bit useless, because there were three people in every assault helicopter company who were the air mission commanders: the CO, the executive officer, who, by the way, was the Australian officer in charge of the Navy people in the group. And that was a gesture of some significance from Colonel Corey. Not having met the Australians at all, he said that the Aussie officer in charge will be my XO. Great move, brilliant move, one of great significance, and I think a brave move, but it worked, and it worked well. So anyway, back to air mission commanders. Three of us, or three people: CO, XO, the Aussie guy. So if the CO of the 135th has got us in peril, well, he ain't going to tell us, oh, you can go out and wait a while and we'll come back and get you later. If it wasn't him, it was the XO, who was an Aussie. And then, of course, horror of horrors, when I became air mission commander at the halfway point in my tour, I was there imperiling the whole of the flight anyway. So we didn't bother. MHHV was far too far away to be able to influence anything, and the bureaucrats could always say, well, we told you so, but you just didn't listen. So they were all right too. Our day began at 4:30 every day at the aircraft during pre-flights. If the aeroplane started up, we would go and have breakfast. If it didn't start whilst we were having breakfast, someone would go and fix it. Am I running out of time? I thought so. Sorry. I've only got 25 minutes left. The aeroplane would be fixed. We would go off with our 15 aircraft, command and control, 10 slicks, 4 gunships. The 10 slicks were the important thing. We had to have them to carry the required number in the company. Splitting companies up in infantry was not a good call. And from that point on, everything was in the lap of the gods. The landing zones were fairly simple things. 10 aircraft would land in them, the troops would get out, and off they'd go. This is a hot LZ. There's some helicopters on the left, there's some action going on the right. On the 3rd of January 1969, one of my pilots was killed, and he was replaced a couple of weeks later by a Sub-Lieutenant Jed Hart. And Jed flew with me for the first time on his first combat assault. I was leading and he came with me. And this is what Jed had to say whilst I played a little movie. Later, with hundreds of combat assaults under my belt, I wouldn't recall one PZ or LZ from another. But That day I remember our mission commander guiding the lead ship of the flight to land short of the 3 burning helicopters. I thought about our narrow workup, where we trundled happily into land in neat formation and hovered gently onto the grass, and you're training the machine gun rounds only going one direction, no one shooting back at you. This wasn't like that at all. There were rockets and minigun being pumped into the tree lines, ordering our own LC, boarding our LC by our own light fire teams, and our gunners and crew chiefs were hammering away with M60s as hard as they could go from every slick, but we were still under heavy fire. When you're in a flight of 10 helicopters, you aren't weaving and ducking, you're following your leader, slowing down and coming to a halt right where the shooting is, and it wasn't comfortable. Our helicopters stayed in the hover for seconds while the troops were hurled out into the paddies. It was done quickly, but we were all no faster than the slowest ship. Once we'd completed the first insertion, we flew off for another so we could do it all over again. About a minute, if that's all right. Promise. These two guys on the left would be the luckiest fellas in the world. Tom Supple on the left, Rick Simmons on the right, both gunship pilots. On this particular day, they were flying together, and with 2 American crew chiefs, Jeffrey Williams and Ronald Corley. At the end of the day, they diverted from the flight to do a little bit of bunker busting. Bunkers had been seen, and off they went. Well, the first run was okay, but they made a second run and got shot down by any number of 50 cal. As Tom says, late one afternoon, our gunship was hit by a 50 cal machine gun, traces the size of golf balls crashed through the perspex, and we're on our way down. Anyway, to cut a long story short, they had an amazing retreat from this site, flat ground, just nothing but paddy walls to hide behind, and the 2 crew chiefs with their M60s were basically the guys who kept them alive until Mike Perrott here on the left, who was the flight leader that day, who had heard some garbled call about someone's down and it's too hot to get in and all the rest of it. Mike went off and rescued them. The distance between Mike and the crew was about 10 or 15 yards, and the distance from the crew and the VCOM, or PABN, was about another 20 metres. They were close. They would have been summarily executed had they failed the mission. They didn't, and off they went. And there's a lovely footnote to this. Whilst on the aircraft, Mike's aircraft, flying back to Bear Cat in the middle of the night, well, not the middle of the night, but black, the 2 crew chiefs cleared their M60s, Tom cleared his M16, and Rick, still very nervous, with an almighty bloody bang in the aeroplane and frightened the hell out of everybody, let off what was in his breech still. Went up through the roof, missed everything that was of importance, and it didn't really matter much there. Mike had taken a few hits in all of this and managed to get away with these guys. And as Tom says, thanks fellas, forever indebted. All right, I'm off onto, I've been burgling for far too long. I'll jump very quickly. What have I done? Go backwards. I won't go long onto this. The Defence Honours and Appeals Tribunal heard statements from us that we could be considered for a unit citation. Now, we were of the view that a meritorious citation was probably good enough for what we could get. That was the thought at the time. The arguments were apparently a lot better because at the end of the day, I lost the bits and pieces there. At the end of the day, the Defence Appeals Tribunal said, no, you're good enough for a unit citation for gallantry, which is pretty big stuff. We had only argued for the helicopter flight, but implied in all of this was that we weren't on our own in any event, and and that the American 135th really were our leaders in this game and were equally deserving of this unit citation for gallantry. That's the last of us who are standing, or most of us who are standing at War Memorial in 2018. I think there's about 70 of the original 190 of us there, and a few wives and sons and so forth of those who haven't made it that far, presented by His Excellency Sir Peter Cosgrove, the Governor General at the time. Lots of statistics. I was in Saigon just for a day, I think around about the 5th or 6th of September 1969. Does the date have any significance for you? 69. September 69. I'll make it simple. On the 2nd of September, Ho Chi Minh died. I would say at least, like my memory is that at least half of the population were wearing black armbands in Saigon. Now you have to ask the question, at that point, what have we achieved? Thank you very much.
Who's that? That's not really you, is it?
No, that's my brother.
Ladies and gents, I'm going to ask if we can hold some questions of Max until...
I hold the time, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fine, absolutely, not a problem. The only comment that I would say, 11,000 hearings.
No, not 7,000 odd hearings, 3,000 of them destroyed in action, and of those 3,000, 22 or 2,300 of their aircrew were killed. No idea about the passengers.
And that famous image after the war finished of the helicopters being turned off the American ships was broken in half then. Yeah, unbelievable. Ladies and gents, I'm going to present Max with a couple of books. Thank you, Max, for an enlightening